I never thought I'd set foot in Blackwood Cemetery again, at least not so soon, and certainly not under these circumstances. It was the kind of place you try to avoid until life's unavoidable events force you to face it. The news of Robert's death took me by surprise, not only because it had been years since we last spoke, but because his sudden passing stirred something within me that I hadn't felt in years. When I got the call, a familiar chill ran down my spine. It was fear, but not the irrational or superstitious kind. It was deeper, rooted in some dark corner of my memory. Robert, George, Daniel, and I had been inseparable during our childhood. We grew up in the same neighborhood, sharing adventures, pranks, and fears. One of the places we often visited, albeit hesitantly, was Blackwood Cemetery. Back then, legends about a phantom gravedigger who wandered the cemetery at night were part of our everyday lives. It was said that the gravedigger, a man who died under tragic circumstances decades ago, sought the souls of those who couldn't rest in peace, trapping them for eternity. As kids, we turned the legend into part of our games, always with a mix of fascination and fear. We dared each other to enter the cemetery after sunset, pushing each other to go just a little farther before fleeing in terror. Those memories, tinged with fear but full of the innocence of childhood, came flooding back in a harsh and vivid way on the day of Robert's funeral. The day was grey and oppressive, the kind of day that seems to foretell something sinister. The three of us, who remained, George, Daniel, and I, gathered at the cemetery, feeling the weight of our missing fourth companion. We hadn't seen Robert in years. Life had pulled us in different directions, but the news of his sudden death brought us back to the place where we had played with the shadows of the past. They said Robert had died in a car accident. At least, that's what we were told. Something inside me resisted believing it, but there was no reason to doubt the story. Blackwood Cemetery hadn't changed much since I last visited. The same weathered headstones, the same rusty iron gates, the same atmosphere of neglect. The place exuded a disturbing stillness, as if the dead resting there were more present than they should be. As we walked the paths toward Robert's freshly dug grave, the memories of the phantom gravedigger resurfaced in my mind like a whispered warning. During the brief service, I felt a shadow hovering over us. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but I noticed George seemed uneasy too. His eyes kept darting to nearby headstones, as if he were looking for something in the gloom of the grey day. Daniel, meanwhile, remained silent, his head bowed, lost in his thoughts. He was likely trying, as I was, to process the loss of our friend. But when Robert's casket was lowered into the ground and the priest recited the final prayers, George suddenly tensed. I saw his eyes widen and a shiver ran through his body. He muttered something I couldn't hear, and as I looked closer, I saw that his gaze was fixed on a spot among the headstones in the distance. My first reaction was to follow his gaze, trying to see what had disturbed him so much. At first I saw nothing unusual, just the same headstones and crosses we had seen countless times before. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the dimness, I noticed something. It was a figure, barely visible, a shadow that seemed to move among the graves. It had no clear shape, but what I saw was enough to make my heart skip a beat. The figure dissolved into the mist settling over the cemetery, but its appearance left an indelible mark on my mind. George began murmuring in a low voice, words I couldn't quite catch, but the tone conveyed a terror I had never heard before. Then abruptly, he broke away from the group and began walking toward where he'd seen the figure, ignoring Daniel's calls. I followed close behind, trying to stop him, but George wouldn't listen. His erratic behavior alarmed me, and for a moment I considered the possibility that he had seen something unreal, a product of his grief-altered imagination. Yet the feeling that something more was happening was impossible to ignore. George started muttering frantically about the gravedigger, saying he'd seen him, that the ghost was coming for him. I tried to calm him, but his panic was contagious. As he ventured deeper into the cemetery, his steps grew clumsy, as if he was struggling against an invisible force pulling him forward. The shadow I had seen earlier resurfaced in my mind, a foreboding that refused to fade. George suddenly stopped in front of a particular grave, collapsing to his knees as he whispered something barely audible. I approached with my heart pounding, and when I reached him, I saw that the headstone before him was the same one we had identified in our childhood as the gravedigger's. A chill enveloped me like a freezing blanket as I saw George's expression. His eyes were wide open, filled with pure, absolute terror, something that couldn't be faked. Then, suddenly, George collapsed, as if all his strength had left him. I knelt beside him, trying to revive him, but his eyes, though open, were empty, as if his soul had been ripped from his body. I felt a presence behind me, something cold and sinister that seemed to be watching me. In that moment, I knew we were not alone. The gravedigger had come for George, and I was next if I didn't leave immediately. Fighting off panic, I lifted George with all my strength and began dragging him back to the main path where Daniel was waiting. I didn't stop moving until we were out of the cemetery. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. Daniel called an ambulance, and George was taken to the hospital, but deep down I knew something had taken a part of him that he would never recover. That night, the presence from the cemetery haunted me. When I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow moving silently among the graves, searching for its next victim. The empty look on George's face remained etched in my mind, a reminder that the gravedigger of Blackwood was not just a childhood legend. There was something more in that cemetery, something restless, something real, something that continued to claim souls. Months later, I received a call informing me that George had disappeared from the hospital. They gave no clear explanation, only that he had walked out one night and never returned. My first thought was the cemetery, but when I went searching I found nothing but silence. Yet in the air I felt that familiar presence, that cold certainty. The gravedigger had taken what he believed was his. Since then, I've lived with the sensation that I'm next. On the darkest nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I feel the shadow drawing closer, patient, waiting for the right moment. And while I try to convince myself it was all a product of our disturbed minds, a part of me knows the truth. The gravedigger of Blackwood is much more than a legend. His hunger for souls is insatiable. All I can do now is wait. For the past several years, I've worked at Wilson Funeral Home, a small family-run business located in a quiet town in Vermont. The funeral home has been in the Wilson family for generations. My grandfather, Henry Wilson, founded it and earned a reputation for respect and dignity in the community. When I inherited the business, I never imagined that darkness and fear would become such regular parts of my life. But something changed a few months ago. Something that has left me questioning not just my sanity, but also the boundaries between the worlds of the living and the dead. My name is James Wilson, and since taking over the funeral home, I've done my best to maintain the same dignity and respect my grandfather and father upheld before me. However, in recent weeks, I've begun receiving late-night phone calls that defy explanation, calls that have driven me to a point of desperation I've never experienced before. It all started one night when I was alone at the funeral home, finishing up some paperwork after a long day. It was near midnight, and the usual silence of the place, which I had always found comforting, felt oppressive, almost as if the entire building was watching me. Suddenly the phone in the office rang, breaking the stillness. The sound startled me. I wasn't expecting any calls at that hour. Normally, late-night calls are emergencies, like coordinating urgent services, but this call was different. I answered the phone. My stomach knotted. On the other end, there was no voice, no breathing, just a deep silence, occasionally interrupted by faint static, as if the line were defective. I waited for several seconds, straining to hear something, anything. Then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, like a murmur. At first, I thought it was interference, but soon I realized it wasn't. What I heard wasn't words, but a low, prolonged moan, a sound drenched in an infinite sadness. The moment it reached my ears, I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and an unbearable sense of anguish settled over me. It was as if something dark and unknown had invaded my mind. After a few seconds, the moan faded, and the line abruptly disconnected. I stood there, the phone still in my hand, trying to process what had just happened. I told myself it must have been a mistake, a wrong number or some kind of prank. But something about the tone of that moan told me otherwise. I hung up the phone and tried to get back to my work, though the feeling of unease lingered. That call was not an isolated incident. Over the following nights, the calls became a pattern, always around midnight, always the same. The phone would ring, I'd answer, and on the other end, there would be silence, followed by that moan. A lament that seemed to carry the weight of unimaginable sorrow. Each time, it felt as if the sound reached deeper into my soul, and each time, the sense of dread it left behind grew stronger. I tried tracing the calls, but the caller ID always displayed unknown number. I reached out to the phone company, but they couldn't provide any useful information. The calls were untraceable, originating from nowhere. As the days turned into weeks, my unease turned to fear. Sleep became impossible. On some nights, as I lay in bed, I thought I could hear the same moan echoing faintly in my room, as if it had followed me home. One night, after receiving the fourth call, I decided to stay at the funeral home and wait by the phone, determined to confront whoever or whatever was behind this. I turned off all the lights and sat in the darkness of my office, my eyes fixed on the phone, my nerves stretched thin. The hours passed slowly, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. At exactly midnight, the phone rang. My heart raced, but I didn't hesitate. I picked up the receiver and waited, my breath shallow. The silence on the other end was almost suffocating. And then it came. The moan, louder this time, more urgent. It filled the room, resonating in my chest, and for the first time I felt something else. A presence. A cold, invisible force seemed to wrap around me, as if the sound itself carried with it a tangible darkness. I spoke, my voice trembling. "Who is this? What do you want?" There was no response. The moan grew louder, and beneath it I could swear I heard faint whispers, too low to understand. The air in the room felt heavy, and a chill ran down my neck. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the call ended. That night was the first time I felt truly afraid, as though something malevolent had stepped into my life uninvited. I knew then that these calls were no coincidence, but I had no idea how to face whatever was causing them. I began to investigate, searching for answers in the history of the town and the funeral home itself. But I found nothing. No tragedies, no unresolved deaths, nothing that could explain the calls. As the weeks went on, the events became more intense. The calls grew more frequent, sometimes multiple times in one night, and the moan, it seemed closer, more desperate with each instance. My health started to decline. The sleepless nights and constant anxiety left me drained, but I couldn't stop thinking about what was happening. One night, everything came to a head in a way I could never have imagined. It was around 2 a.m. when the phone rang again. By then, the sound of the ringing itself had become a source of dread, a harbinger of what would come next. I picked up the receiver with trembling hands, and this time, before I could say a word, I heard something that froze me in place. It wasn't just the moan, it was a scream, a howl of pure agony so intense that I nearly dropped the phone. The sound filled the room, rattling my thoughts, echoing in my head long after it stopped. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The lights in the viewing room began to flicker, and a sudden, inexplicable wind seemed to rush through the building, though all the windows were closed. That was the moment I realized I couldn't stay there any longer. I slammed the phone down, but the scream lingered in my mind, reverberating as if it had etched itself into my soul. I ran from the funeral home without even bothering to turn. Off the lights, leaving behind the eerie creak of the doors and the inexplicable wind that seemed to follow me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark at home, every small noise making me jump, the scream replaying in my thoughts like a haunting refrain. By morning, I knew. I knew what I had to do. The following day, I made the decision to temporarily close the funeral home. It was something I had never done before, but I couldn't face another night like the last. I put a sign on the door informing the community that the funeral home would be closed until further notice. I didn't offer any explanations, but a few neighbors must have noticed the exhaustion etched on my face, the urgency in my actions. No one asked any questions. For that, I was grateful. Since then, I've tried to distance myself from everything related to death and the funeral home, but it hasn't been easy. The calls stopped after I closed the place, at least for now, but the fear persists. Sometimes in the stillness of the night, I feel the phone will ring again, and that desperate scream will invade my mind once more. I moved to another town, hoping to leave it all behind. But the fear follows me like a shadow that never fully fades. I've sought advice from priests and spiritual counselors, searching for answers or solace, but no one has been able to provide a clear explanation for what happened. Some suggested it might have been the spirit of someone who couldn't find peace, perhaps someone buried without the proper rites. Others theorized that it could be a manifestation of my own fears and guilt, something that had taken form as those calls. Deep down, I know it doesn't matter how many explanations I search for. Nothing will change what I experienced. The calls were real. The moans and screams were real, and the darkness they brought with them still lingers, somewhere, waiting. Because even though I closed the funeral home, I couldn't close the door to whatever opened that first night, and I fear that someday the phone will ring again. And when it does, I'll know that the terror never truly left, that it was always waiting in the shadows of the early morning. I've never been one to believe in ghosts, apparitions, or anything remotely supernatural. I've always considered myself a logical person, rooted in the tangible and explainable world. However, what happened at the funeral of Samuel Reynolds, a childhood friend, defies every rational explanation I've tried to come up with. I've never shared this story with anyone, but now I feel it's time to document what I experienced in that small rural town, where reason and terror collided in ways I never imagined possible. Samuel and I grew up together in Willow Creek, a small town tucked away in the rolling hills of Vermont. It was the kind of place where nothing much happened, and life followed a slow, predictable rhythm. Samuel was a quiet, solitary boy, more interested in nature than in the company of other kids. I often found him exploring the nearby woods or wandering through the fields at sunset. Over the years, his inclination for solitude grew, and he eventually became a reserved man, almost a recluse, living alone in the house he inherited from his parents on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a surprise when I heard that Samuel had died alone, with no one by his side. The news reached me in the city, where I had moved a decade earlier. Though I hadn't kept in touch with Samuel, I felt a pang of sadness and decided to return to Willow Creek for his funeral. It felt like the right thing to do, a final goodbye to a friendship that, while distant now, had once been meaningful. The day of the funeral, Willow Creek was just as sleepy as I remembered. The dusty streets were nearly empty, and the small-town church where the service would take place stood solitary under a grey, overcast sky. I arrived early, hoping to see a few familiar faces, but the church was nearly empty. Only a handful of elderly townsfolk and a couple of distant relatives were present, a reflection of the isolated life Samuel had led in his later years. Samuel's casket was placed at the front of the church, surrounded by candles and flowers that did little to dispel the coldness of the atmosphere. I watched as a few attendees approached the casket to pay their respects in silence, their faces marked by melancholy and perhaps a touch of relief to still be among the living. I lingered in the back, waiting my turn to say goodbye. Finally, it was time for the final farewell. The pastor, an old man who seemed as weathered as the town itself, began reciting prayers as the small congregation formed a line to view Samuel's face one last time. I joined the line, feeling a strange mix of sadness and curiosity, as if seeing him might revive some forgotten memory of our shared childhood. But what happened next was something none of us could have prepared for. When one of Samuel's relatives opened the casket for the last goodbye, a stifled gasp echoed through the church. I rushed forward to see what had caused the reaction, and what I saw froze me in place. The casket was empty. The space where Samuel's body should have been was completely devoid of any sign of him. The white linens were perfectly arranged, but there was no trace of the deceased. A wave of panic rippled through the small crowd. Murmurs turned into exclamations, and chaos erupted within seconds. Some attendees fled the church, while others frantically searched the surrounding area, as if Samuel's body might have somehow wandered off and hidden itself in a corner. The pastor tried to calm the congregation, but his voice was lost in the uproar. I stood there immobile, unable to process what I was seeing. How could Samuel's body be gone? Where could it be? As those questions swirled in my mind, someone in the crowd mentioned seeing Samuel the previous night, walking through the town streets. At first, the statement was met with skepticism, but others began nodding, fear flickering in their eyes as they recalled similar sightings. They claimed they'd seen a figure resembling Samuel wandering the town after nightfall, his face pale and expressionless. My first instinct was to dismiss these claims as hallucinations brought on by grief and confusion. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I knew Samuel was dead. His body had been found lifeless in his home. How then? Could anyone have seen him walking around? Driven by a desperate need for answers, I decided to investigate. I walked the streets of Willow Creek, speaking to those who claimed to have seen Samuel. Each account I heard was more unsettling than the last. Some described him passing by without saying a word, his gaze vacant. Others swore they had seen him vanish into thin air, as though he were never there at all. No one could give me a coherent explanation, and my initial skepticism began to crumble. That night, I stayed in a small inn on the edge of town, unable to sleep. My mind replayed the events of the day, trying to make sense of them. Finally, I decided the only way to quiet my thoughts was to visit Samuel's house, the place where he had died. Perhaps I could find a clue, something to explain the disappearance of his body and the strange sightings around town. Samuel's house stood on the slope of a hill, surrounded by trees that swayed gently in the night breeze. The moon hung high in the sky as I approached, and a sense of unease settled over me. The house felt heavy, like it was holding on to secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. I forced the lock easily, the door creaking as it opened into the stillness of the night. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and dust. The house was just as I remembered from my childhood visits, yet there was something different, an energy I couldn't name, that made my skin crawl. As I made my way through the dark hallway, my footsteps echoed on the wooden floors. Finally, I reached the room where Samuel's body had been found. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, a chill ran down my spine. The room was empty, but the air felt dense, almost tangible. I scanned the space for any sign of what had happened, but found nothing, until my eyes landed on the far corner. There, just beyond the reach of the moonlight filtering through the window, was something that made me take a step back. At first, I thought it was a shadow. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was something more, a figure, a human shape, unmoving, watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was there, observing me. I wanted to convince myself it was a trick of the light, an illusion, created by the shadows in the room, but deep down I knew better. The figure remained still, its presence undeniable, and the air in the room grew colder with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest, and a primal fear rooted me to the spot. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It didn't walk or shift as a person would. Instead, it seemed to dissolve into the darkness, like smoke dissipating in the air. The relief I felt was brief because, at that exact moment, I heard a whisper. A sound so faint it was almost imperceptible, yet it carried a weight that made my stomach drop. The whisper wasn't in any language I could understand, but its meaning was clear. I didn't belong there. I had trespassed into a space I wasn't meant to enter. The memory of the empty casket, the whispers, and the figure in the shadows serves as a chilling reminder that there are forces in this, a world that defy understanding, and that sometimes they reach out to us in ways we can't ignore. Even now, far from Willow Creek, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me. In the dead of night I hear faint sounds, almost like breathing just beyond my door. Shadows shift in the corners of my vision, vanishing the moment I turn my head. And worst of all, in my darkest, loneliest moments, I hear that whisper again, faint but persistent. I try to convince myself it's just my mind playing tricks on me, that grief and exhaustion warped my perception of that night. But deep down, I know better. Some things are not meant to be understood, and some things, once they find you, never truly let go. I found myself in Detroit, a city known for its contrasts, a place where elegance and decay coexist in an endless dance. After a string of dead-end jobs, I stumbled upon an offer that, while initially unsettling, became a necessity. Watkins' Funeral Home, a long-standing business that had been the subject of local rumors and whispers, was hiring. The pay was good, better than any job I'd held recently, and given my situation, I couldn't afford to be choosy. The funeral home was located in a quieter, less-traveled part of the city, nestled in a shadowed alley between old, weather-worn buildings. From the outside, the place didn't seem particularly unusual, though it had an air of neglect, dust-covered windows, peeling paint on its faded brick exterior. Despite my unease, I entered determined to make a solid impression. I was greeted by Mr. Watkins, the owner, a man in his 60s whose deeply lined face seemed to tell 1,000 grim stories. I had heard whispers about him around town, vague allegations of shady dealings and sinister practices, but again, I wasn't in a position to decline the job. He explained my duties with a measured tone and gave me a tour of the facility. The building, while tidy, carried a peculiar smell, a mix of dampness and something else, something faint but disquieting that I couldn't quite place. My first week passed without incident. My tasks were straightforward: cleaning the viewing rooms, organizing caskets, and ensuring everything was ready for services. Most funerals were small and sparsely attended, which struck me as odd, given Detroit's bustling population. The silence in the building often felt heavy, as though the walls themselves held secrets. Still, I told myself it was just the nature of the job. It didn't take long for strange things to start happening. The first oddity came one evening when I was preparing a viewing room for a funeral scheduled the next morning. As I scrubbed the polished marble floor, I noticed faint markings etched into the tiles, barely visible but deliberate. They formed a circular pattern, intricate and oddly precise. I crouched to examine them closer, my skin prickling as unease crept over me. These weren't scratches or scuffs. They seemed intentional, almost ritualistic. I dismissed the thought, convincing myself it was nothing more than the overactive imagination of a new employee. But the rumors I'd heard about Watkins' funeral home began to haunt me. Stories of unclaimed bodies disappearing, families not receiving their loved ones' remains, and whispers of dark practices conducted under the cover of night. Curiosity got the better of me. I began asking discreet questions around town, seeking out former employees. Most avoided the topic entirely, their eyes betraying discomfort whenever the funeral home was mentioned. One ex-employee, however, told me something that made my blood run cold. There was a rumor, he said, just a rumor, he stressed, that Mr. Watkins had made a deal, a pact involving the unclaimed bodies brought to the funeral home. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press him, but the thought lingered. Then came the night I saw something that would shatter any sense of normalcy I had left. One evening, as I was preparing to lock up for the night, I heard a faint noise coming from the basement, a low, almost imperceptible sound that sent a chill down my spine. The basement was a place Mr. Watkins had explicitly told me not to enter without his permission. I had always respected that rule, but something about the sound compelled me to investigate. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the dimly lit basement. A single flickering bulb at the end of the corridor cast long, wavering shadows along the cracked concrete walls. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint noise grew louder, still indistinct but undeniably human-like, almost like a whisper or a muted sob. At the end of the corridor stood an old wooden door, its surface scarred and weathered as though it had been there for decades. It was slightly ajar, and from the other side a faint glow seeped out. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open. What I saw froze me in place. I've started dreaming of the basement again. Each time the dreams feel more vivid, more real. I see the symbols glowing, the body on the table shifting, and the whispers growing louder, surrounding me. I wake up screaming, drenched in sweat. The image of those lifeless eyes burned into my memory. I don't know how much longer I can endure this. Every day feels like a battle against something I can't see but can always feel. The shadows grow darker, the whispers grow louder, and the sense of impending doom is suffocating. If this is my fate, if this is the price of whatever unknowable force I disturbed, then I can only hope someone finds this account. Let it serve as a warning. There are things in this world we aren't meant to see, boundaries we aren't meant to cross. And if you ever find yourself working in a place like Watkins' funeral home, heed this advice. Never, under any circumstances, open the door to the basement. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. It's not common to attend a funeral at midnight. Farewells are usually given during the day, under the sunlight that, even when pale and distant, offers a comfort the night cannot provide. Yet the funeral of Matthew Robinson was held at the darkest hour of the night at the request of his mother, a deeply superstitious woman who believed that evil spirits claimed the souls of those buried in daylight. Matthew had died under mysterious circumstances. No one knew exactly what had happened, only that he had been found lifeless in his home, lying on the floor of his bedroom with his eyes open and an expression of terror frozen on his face. The news spread quickly through the small town of Cedar Hollow, a place where everyone knew each other and where rumors traveled like wildfire. The whispers about his death were as dark as the night itself. Some said it was a sudden heart attack, while others muttered about curses and supernatural forces that had taken his life. I decided to attend the funeral out of respect for his family. We weren't close friends, but Matthew and I had shared a few evenings at the local bar, chatting about trivial, forgettable things. I couldn't imagine what his family, especially his mother, was going through. I thought my presence might offer some comfort, though I knew nothing could truly fill the void left by the loss of her son. The small church in Cedar Hollow stood at the center of town, an ancient stone building that had withstood the passage of time. That night, the sky was thick with clouds, and not a single star was visible. As I walked the deserted streets toward the church, the chill of the night air seeped into my bones. There was no traffic, no sound, only the echo of my footsteps in the oppressive silence. When I arrived, I noticed the church was dimly lit by candles placed along the pews. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, giving the place an almost otherworldly atmosphere. The few attendees sat, quietly, heads bowed, as if the weight of the night and the tragedy were too much to bear. I took a seat in the back row, wanting to observe the ceremony without drawing attention to myself. Matthew's casket stood at the front, open for mourners to say their final goodbyes. His body lay inside, dressed in a black suit, his hands folded across his chest, His face, pale and expressionless, didn't reflect the terror described by those who had found him. I wondered if the mortician had deliberately softened his features, or if the true horror had somehow been trapped in the night. The pastor, an older man with a deep, resonant voice, began. The darkness stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, as suddenly as it had gone out, the lights flickered back to life. I squinted against the brightness, my eyes adjusting to the sudden change. The first thing I did was look toward the casket. What I saw made my blood run cold. Matthew's body had shifted. His head, which had been resting straight and still, was now slightly turned to the side, his lifeless eyes seemingly fixed on the front pew where his mother sat. His hands, once carefully folded over his chest, now lay at his sides. The change was subtle, but it was unmistakable. A low gasp escaped my lips, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. A murmur of panic began to spread through the congregation. Some of the mourners rose from their seats, their faces pale and their movements hesitant, while others remained frozen, too terrified to react. The pastor, visibly shaken, tried to regain control of the room. "Please, everyone remain calm. It must have been an accident," he said, though his voice betrayed his own fear. But there was no way to explain what we were seeing, not with logic, not with reason. The candles began to flicker more violently now, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. My unease deepened as I realized the shadows weren't just reflections of the living. They moved independently, creeping along the walls like specters of their own. Before I could process what was happening, the lights went out again. This time, the darkness was accompanied by a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It was low and guttural, like a voice trying to form words, but never quite succeeding. The whisper grew louder, echoing through the church until it became a cacophony of overlapping voices. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside me, reverberating through my very core. When the lights returned once more, Matthew's body had changed again. This time, his head was fully turned, his open eyes staring directly at his mother. His hands gripped the sides of the casket, and his expression, once serene, now bore the unmistakable trace of a smile. A cold, unnatural smile that sent a wave of terror through the room. His mother let out a scream that shattered the oppressive silence. The mourners panicked, rushing toward the exits, pushing and shoving in their desperation to escape. I stood frozen, unable to take my eyes off Matthew's face. It was as though he were alive again, but not in any way I could understand. Something else was animating him, something that didn't belong in our world. The pastor fell to his knees, clutching his cross and muttering prayers, his voice trembling with fear. I wanted to run, to join the others fleeing the church, but my legs wouldn't move. The air was thick with a suffocating pressure, and the whispers were back, louder than ever, swirling around me like a storm. Then the candles went out for the final time. In the absolute darkness, I heard a sound I will never forget, the creak of wood, like a heavy weight shifting inside the casket. And then footsteps. They were slow at first, deliberate, moving with an unnatural rhythm. My heart thundered in my chest as the sound grew louder, closer. I wanted to scream, to beg for it to stop, but no words would come. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, drowning out every other thought. When the lights came back, the casket was empty. Matthew's body was nowhere to be seen. His mother, still frozen in shock, let out another scream and collapsed to the floor. The few mourners who had stayed until now scrambled toward the doors, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. The pastor remained on his knees, clutching his cross so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his prayers reduced to broken whispers. I couldn't move. My eyes remained fixed on the casket, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. The candles flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows across the walls. It felt as if the room itself was alive, pulsing with an unnatural energy. Then I heard it again, footsteps. This time they came from behind me, slow, deliberate, and growing louder. I turned my head slowly, my breath caught in my throat. At first, I saw nothing but the flickering light of the candles reflecting off the stone walls, but then, in the far corner of the church, a figure began to emerge from the shadows. It was Matthew, or what looked like him. His face was pale, his eyes wide open, staring directly at me. That unnatural smile still stretched across his lips, but it didn't belong to him. It was something else, something wearing his body like a mask. "Matthew?" I whispered, though I already knew there would be no response. The figure didn't move, but the air around him seemed to ripple like heat rising from pavement. I could feel an intense cold radiating from him, freezing me in place. The whispers returned, louder, now echoing through the church like a chorus of voices. They weren't just coming from Matthew. They were everywhere, reverberating off the walls, filling every corner of the room. I covered my ears, but it was no use. The sound wasn't just external, it was inside my head, burrowing deeper with every passing second. Then Matthew, or the thing that wore his face, began to move. He stepped forward, his motions jerky and unnatural, as if he were being pulled by invisible strings. His head tilted to one side, and his eyes never left mine. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to run, but my legs refused to obey. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in, suffocating me. When he was just a few feet away, he stopped. The whispers fell silent for a moment. I never thought working at a funeral home could be so unsettling. After spending most of my life in New York City and years bouncing between unsatisfying jobs, I stumbled upon an opening at Harrison & Sons Funeral Home, a modest establishment in one of the city's older neighborhoods. At first I thought it would be a quiet, uneventful job. After all, what could be more peaceful than a place filled with those who have already passed on? Little did I know I was stepping into a world where peace was the last thing I'd find. The funeral home was located in a part of town that had seen better days. The surrounding buildings were crumbling, their facades marked by decades of wear and neglect. The noise of traffic and street vendors filled the air during the day, but the funeral home itself was a sanctuary of silence. From the moment I stepped inside, I noticed a change in the atmosphere. The air felt heavier, as though the building held onto the weight of every life it had memorialized. My first few days were uneventful. My duties were simple: receive the bodies, prepare them for viewing, and assist with the funerals. Most of the deceased had passed away in hospitals or peacefully at home, their families coming to say goodbye in solemn ceremonies before departing, leaving behind an almost palpable emptiness. Occasionally, however, there were bodies that no one came to claim. Individuals who had died alone, their remains sent to the funeral home by local authorities to await burial in unmarked graves. At first, I didn't think much about these cases. I knew loneliness and abandonment were harsh realities of modern life. But one night, everything changed. It was a late evening, and I was about to close up after a long day when an unexpected delivery arrived. The body of an older man, around 50 years old. I wasn't given much information, just that he had been found dead in an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city, with no identification or family to claim him. As I looked at the body, an inexplicable chill crept over me. There was something off about him that I couldn't quite place. His face was unusually peaceful, but his closed eyes seemed wrong, as if they could snap open at any moment and fix me with a lifeless stare. I shook off the feeling, blaming my exhaustion, and placed him in one of the prep rooms until he could be properly attended to. That night, as I locked up the funeral home and stepped out into the cool New York air, I felt an undeniable sense of being watched. The streets were empty, and the noise of the city seemed muted, almost as if the funeral home itself had swallowed the sound. I glanced over my shoulder more than once on the way home, but no one was there. Still, the sensation clung to me like a shadow. The next few days were even stranger. Lights in the funeral home began to flicker more often. At first I chalked it up to the old building's wiring, but the occurrences grew more frequent and more deliberate. It was as if the flickers followed me, no matter which room I entered. Sometimes I'd find items slightly out of place, caskets slightly ajar when I knew I had closed them, flowers inexplicably wilted overnight. A faint, musty smell began to permeate the air, a mix of damp earth and decaying flowers that lingered even after the rooms were thoroughly cleaned. Then came the whispers. It started one night as I was finishing some paperwork. At first, I thought it was the wind, soft, indistinct murmurs drifting through the hallways. But as the minutes passed, the whispers grew clearer. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably human. They seemed to echo from the walls, bouncing through the empty rooms surrounding me. I left the funeral home in a rush that night, locking the doors behind me and telling myself it was just my imagination, but I knew better. The following night, I stayed late again, determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head. The funeral home was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I was reviewing documents in the office when I heard it, a faint whisper. closer this time. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stand and investigate. As I stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the whispers grew louder, their direction shifting with every step I took. It was as if they were circling me, leading me deeper into the building. My footsteps echoed in the silence, and I felt the weight of the air pressing down on me. The whispers led me to the prep room, where the unclaimed body of the man had been placed. The moment I stepped inside, the whispers stopped. The room was freezing, far colder than it should have been. I reached for the light switch, but as I flicked it on, the bulb sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Then I saw it. In the faint glow of the emergency exit sign, a shadow moved across the room. At first, I thought it was my own reflection, distorted by the dim light. But as I stood frozen, I realized the shadow wasn't mimicking my movements. It was watching me. The figure was tall, its edges blurred as if it were made of smoke. It stood near the gurney where the man's body lay, unmoving, as though it were guarding him. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and invasive, like it was burrowing into my mind. My breath caught as the shadow began to move, gliding toward me in utter silence. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. Before I could react, the figure vanished, melting into the darkness as if it had never been there. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, replaying the scene in my mind, trying to rationalize what I had seen, but no explanation made sense. The next day, I confided in Mr. Harrison, the funeral home's owner. His reaction only deepened my unease. He listened intently, his face grave, and when I finished, he sighed heavily. "You're not the first to notice things," he said. "This place has a history, one that stretches back longer than I've been alive." He explained that the funeral home had been built on the site of an old cemetery, one that had been hastily relocated decades ago. "Not all the graves were properly marked or moved," he admitted. "Some say the spirits of those forgotten still linger here, tied to the land." I wanted to laugh, to dismiss his words as superstition, but the memory of the shadow froze the laugh in my throat. Mr. Harrison offered to bring in a priest to bless the building, but I knew it wouldn't help. Whatever was haunting the funeral home wasn't going to leave so easily. That night, I decided it was time to quit. I stayed only long enough to gather my things, my every step accompanied by the now familiar whispers. As I passed through the hallways one last time, I felt the weight of unseen eyes following me, and I knew I wouldn't be free of them just by leaving. As I reached the door, I turned back for one final glance. The hall behind me was empty, but the air felt alive, charged with a presence I couldn't see. Then just as I stepped outside, the whispers ceased. The sudden silence was almost worse, like the funeral home itself was watching me leave, knowing I'd never truly escape it. Since then, I've moved to another city, far from the shadows of Harrison and Son's funeral home, but the fear has stayed with me. At night, when the world is quiet, I hear the whispers again, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Sometimes I see shadows flicker at the edge of my vision, and I feel that same oppressive gaze. I've told myself it's just my imagination, but deep down I know the truth. The shadows of the funeral home aren't bound by its walls. They've followed me, and they're waiting. For what? I don't know. But I'm certain of one thing. Some places hold on to the dead, refusing to let them go, and once you step into their domain, you'll never truly leave. There was something unsettling about the way the wind moved through the dead leaves that morning. Thick grey clouds blanketed the sky over Crestwood, a small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, as if a heavy hand of fate had settled over us. The entire town seemed caught in a strange lethargy, an oppressive calm that hinted at something looming. Though I wasn't particularly superstitious, the air had felt different ever since David Sullivan's death. His funeral, however, was when things truly began to unravel. David had been one of those people destined for greatness. His charisma was magnetic, and his smile could disarm anyone. His death was a shock, a senseless accident that had stolen him away so abruptly that no one had time to process it. He'd been driving on one of the narrow mountain roads that snaked around Crestwood, when, for reasons unknown, his car veered off the edge and plummeted into the ravine below. They found him the next day, lifeless and broken. The news rippled through our tight-knit community, sending everyone into a state of shared grief. The day of his funeral, the small church in Crestwood was packed. Wooden pews overflowed, and those who couldn't find a seat stood pressed against the stone walls. Candles burned silently, their soft light flickering in rhythm with the heavy breaths and quiet sobs of those gathered. The scent of incense mingled with the floral arrangements, creating a bittersweet haze that hung over the room. The priest began his eulogy, his voice low and measured, as the congregation sat in reverent silence. But even in that moment, I felt it, an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't explain. The air inside the church seemed charged, vibrating with a tension that prickled at the edges of my mind. And then it started. At first it was subtle, an echo that seemed to follow the priest's words, faint enough that I thought I was imagining it. Each time he spoke David's name, the sound would repeat, bouncing off the stone walls of the church. It wasn't the usual acoustics of the room. This echo had a depth to it, a resonance that didn't belong. As the priest continued, the echo grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a repetition of his words anymore. It was a murmur, low and guttural, as if the walls themselves had found a voice. My hands gripped the pew in front of me as a chill crept up my spine. I glanced around, searching for confirmation in the faces of others. Most seemed lost in their grief, but a few furrowed their brows, their expressions tight with confusion. The priest faltered for a moment, his voice wavering, but he quickly regained his composure and pressed on. Yet the echo persisted. It was no longer content to mirror his words. It began forming something of its own. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but the sound crawled under my skin, filling me with a nameless dread. By the time the priest reached the closing prayer, the echo had grown deafening. It reverberated through the room, an otherworldly sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My gaze was locked on David's casket, which sat at the front of the church, adorned with white lilies and a cross. It looked wrong, as though it didn't belong in that space. I couldn't shake the thought that something was inside it, something watching us. The priest finally stopped speaking, his words swallowed by the cacophony of the echo. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then a noise shattered the stillness, the unmistakable sound of wood creaking. I froze. Slowly, my eyes moved to the casket. It shifted, just slightly, but enough that everyone in the room saw it. Gasps erupted from the congregation, and several people stood, their faces pale with fear. My heart pounded as the air around me grew. Cold, thick with an invisible pressure that made it hard to move, and then the candles went out. The room was plunged into darkness, so complete it felt suffocating. The whispers began again, louder this time, circling us like a rising storm. I gripped the edge of the pew, desperate to steady myself. Somewhere in the darkness, a woman screamed. The sound snapped something inside me, and I scrambled to my feet, feeling my way toward the nearest door. Before I could reach it, the candles flickered back to life. The faint light illuminated the room in uneven bursts, casting eerie, elongated shadows on the walls. I turned toward the casket and froze. The lid was open. The sight sent a wave of panic through the room. People began to push toward the exits, their movements frantic and uncoordinated, but I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the empty casket, my mind racing to understand what was happening. The flowers that had been perfectly arranged around it were scattered on the floor, as though something had clawed its way out. Then I heard it. A soft, shuffling noise coming from the back of the church. My body tensed as I slowly turned, my eyes scanning the pews. At first I saw nothing, but then in the dim light of the candles I saw a figure standing in the shadows near the door. It was David, or at least it looked like him. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring directly at me. His body moved awkwardly, jerking with each step, as though something else was controlling him. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, the echo returned, louder and more chaotic than before, filling the room with an unbearable noise. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me out of the church and into the freezing night air. Others followed, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes filled with the same fear I felt. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The next day I learned that the church had been sealed off. No one could explain what had happened, but rumors spread quickly. Some said David's soul had been trapped, unable to move on. Others believed something darker had claimed him, using his death as a gateway to reach us. I left Crestwood soon after, unable to bear the weight of what I'd seen. But the echo has stayed with me. On quiet nights, I still hear it, faint but unmistakable. It follows me, a constant reminder of that night and the horrors that unfolded. I don't know what truly happened in that church, but I know this. Some echoes are more than just sound. They are voices from places we're not meant to hear, and once they find you, they never let go. Everett and Sons Funeral Home was a modest building tucked away on a quiet street in Birmingham, Alabama. Growing up, I had passed it countless times, never giving it much thought. Years later, when I found myself in desperate need of steady work, a job opening there seemed like an unexpected but welcome opportunity. Though the thought of working with the dead unsettled me at first, the pay was decent, and the tasks seemed straightforward. At first, the job was everything I expected. The funeral home, though old, was impeccably maintained by Mr. Everett, the owner. A man of few words, he was professional and kind, but there was something about his quiet demeanor that unnerved me. The building had an almost reverent stillness about it, the kind of silence that made you acutely aware of your every breath and movement. For weeks, my days were filled with routine tasks, preparing viewing rooms, assisting with services, and ensuring everything was in order. The steady rhythm of the job began to feel normal, but then the whispers began. At first I thought they were just my imagination. Late at night, as I stayed behind to finish paperwork or tidy up the viewing rooms, I'd hear a faint murmur. They were so soft that I convinced myself they were just the hum of the old building settling. But as the days passed, they grew louder, more distinct, until there was no denying what I was hearing. The sounds seemed to come from the walls, a low, rhythmic murmur that I couldn't quite understand. At times, it was almost like a conversation, a soft exchange between voices that I could never pinpoint. I'd pause my work and strain to listen, but the whispers always faded when I focused on them, leaving only an oppressive silence. One night, I decided to investigate. It was close to midnight, and the funeral home was completely still. I followed the sound down a narrow hallway that led to the morgue. As I approached, the whispers grew louder, their tone shifting from soft and mournful to sharp and urgent. My heart pounded in my chest, but I pressed on, determined to find the source. When I entered the morgue, the whispers stopped. The room was freezing, far colder than usual, and a faint smell of damp earth lingered in the air. The overhead light flickered weakly, casting long shadows over the rows of metal drawers that lined the walls. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the icy air, waiting for something to happen. Then, from the far corner of the room, I heard it, a faint, guttural sigh. It wasn't the wind or the creak of the old building. It was deliberate, human, and it sent a chill down my spine. I turned and left the morgue, locking the door behind me. I didn't look back. Over the next few days, things escalated. The whispers followed me everywhere I went, growing louder and more insistent. Objects began to move on their own, chairs slightly out of place, doors left ajar when I knew I had closed them. The smell of damp earth became a constant presence, clinging to the air no matter how often I cleaned. One evening, as I prepared a viewing room for a service, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The casket, which had been sealed earlier, that day, was slightly open. My hands trembled as I approached it, the faint whispers growing louder with every step. When I peered inside, the body was still there, untouched, but the lining of the casket was wrinkled, as if something had shifted inside. I slammed the lid shut and backed away, my heart racing. The whispers were deafening now, echoing through the room like a chorus of invisible voices. I fled to the office and locked the door, refusing to leave until morning. The final straw came a week later. It was late, and I was the only one in the building. As I locked up for the night, I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow and deliberate, growing louder with each step. I turned, expecting to see Mr. Everett or one of the other staff, but the hallway was empty. Empty. The footsteps continued, now echoing from the direction of the morgue. I knew I should leave, but something compelled me to follow. My legs felt like lead as I walked down the hall, the sound of my own heartbeat, nearly drowning out the phantom steps. When I reached the morgue, the door was ajar, though I distinctly remembered locking it. I pushed it open, and the whispers stopped. The room was completely dark, save for the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. I fumbled for the light switch, but it didn't work. The cold was suffocating, and the smell of earth was overpowering. Then, in the corner of the room, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest of the room, seemed to rise from the floor. It moved, not like a person, but like smoke, coiling in the air. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow grew larger, its shape becoming more defined. I couldn't see a face, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into my soul. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the room with a cacophony of sorrow and anger. I stumbled backward, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. The shadow began to move toward me, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was outside in the freezing night air. I didn't look back. I quit the next morning, Mr. Everett didn't ask for an explanation, and I didn't offer one. His only words as I left were, "You're not the first to leave." Even now, months later, I can't escape the memories. On quiet nights I still hear the whispers, faint and distant, but unmistakable. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of shadows moving in the corners of my vision, and I feel the same cold dread I felt in the morgue. I don't know what haunts Everett and Son's funeral home, but I know this. Some places carry echoes of the past, echoes that refuse to fade, and once you hear them, they never truly leave you.